Hello everyone, I am TheSkilledRoy, and welcome to our Fireside Chat with Rioters. This year has been absolutely incredible for Legends of Runeterra. We started beta all the way back in January, and it took the card game world by storm. We saw the addition of Bilgewater with the official release of the game, and this game would see then constant updates and balance changes, making it easily one of the freshest CCGs out there. Events like Spirit Blossom and Kda brought tons of great emotes and cosmetics to the game, not to mention some of the most built around cards with the Kda Card Drop. Tournaments also began with the European Masters, but also with the announcement of the seasonal tournaments, which would then cap off each expansion. And of course, just this past week, we saw the final expansion of the Targon release, bringing Zoe, Victor, and Riven to the game. Over 600 cards, 48 champions, and I can't even count how many decks. Legends of Runeterra has had an amazing first year. We owe this, of course, to our rioters, who I have with me here now. So let's just go ahead and have you guys introduce yourselves.
Cool. Hi. I'm Jenny. I'm Riot Tiny Bun. I was a producer on our sets team, our narrative team, and previous to that, I worked on our tutorials, store, social, and expeditions. We're super happy to be here, and I just want to say we actually owe it all to you guys, the players. So we absolutely wouldn't be here without you.
Sure, I'll go next. My name is Travis. I'm Riot Dovagedys. I am currently the product lead for gameplay and cards on Legends of Runeterra. Over the past year, I've worked on basically everything that you see once you're inside of a game, except for the cosmetic content, which is who we have to thank next, who's Jake.
Hi, I'm Jake, Riot AlphaLvSim, and I am a systems designer on Legend of Runeterra, which that means I don't make cards, but I work on different systems and games you'll see. So the efforts I've spearheaded have been our quest system, Spirit Blossom, and the recent release of Prismatic, so that's some of my work. But also part of my job is I'm one of the leaders in our group called Rainbow Rioters, which supports LGBTQ rioters and players. So the Rainbow Poro you saw in game, the Idaho icons you saw in League and TFT, that was also part of my team's work.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming by. It's been, I think we can all agree, an absolutely incredible year for LOR overall. Just like, let's recount some of the your favorite moments from it overall. Like, when I was sort of playing LOR for the first time, I have to say, like, I think one big thing that LOR really answered for a lot of the League of Legends players was a bigger look into the world of Runeterra, right? When I first booted up in beta, I was shocked to see I finally got to see like all these characters. I got to see Mage Seekers. I got to see all the Reckoners. I got to see all these new characters who I had never even conceptualized before. I was just told they existed. So I literally spent like probably days just sifting through all the amazing art we had just for each of these characters, spells, and like different animations and stuff like that as well. Just off the top of your head, do you guys have any favorite moments you had like sort of working on LOR throughout this year?
There have been a ton of highlights. Just as a from a player perspective myself, I really love narrative. So getting to see the like building out the world of Runeterra was exciting for me too. I've loved one of the personally most exciting moments for me is we've had access to these cards for a while. We were working on the game for a while. My 17-year-old cousin plays, and every single time I've played him, he has beaten me. Doesn't matter what deck he runs, he makes better decisions than I do, no matter what cards he has in his hands, and I lose to him every time. And that just feels like super cool to see a game we spent so much time on go live and have people be way better at it than I am. And it's actually super fun to lose to my cousin Matthew.
What a
So I think
wholesome answer.
that was great. That's so great.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I think for me it would have to be Spirit Blossom. So it was this massive effort, not just on Legends of Runeterra, but throughout the company. We were coordinating our efforts with League and TFT, including making sure we didn't accidentally leak Yone, which was a process you might not have noticed. But partway through the Spirit Blossom event, we actually swapped the background and added Yone back in, and like there were many fraught meetings making sure that worked. But it was so wonderful seeing players engage with all this really cool content, and that was our first event ever, and I'm really happy that it resonated with players.
Yeah, I think that was I think the first big event where I pointed to. I'm like, this is exactly what I can picture across all of the games happening, like these entire spanning across all league properties, basically these incredibly huge events, and especially for I just want to say for LOR. LOL got a bunch of skins, but LOR we actually got to see Spirit Blossoms of non-champions, which was huge for us. Like we didn't even think that that was gonna happen. We was like, okay, we're probably gonna get Spirit Blossom Yasuo because he's in the game as well. But to have Karina as well, it was like, oh, this is a nice treat because it really does feel like LOR is being treated to that level of respect for its sort of cosmetics as well, which was really really awesome. So I want to thank you for that specifically as well.
Yeah, it was great. It was like a really, really talented team. Like I was lucky to be a small part of like a really awesome launch for that.
Mm-hmm. Dovagedys, how do you feel about this year so far? Do you have anything you wanted to sort of make a note on?
I mean, this year has been amazing. It's kind of crazy how much has gone into this year. I think so. It's really hard to pick a single moment, but I think one of my favorite things. Well, I guess one of my favorite moments was once after we went launch and got out of beta in April. About the end of May, it was pretty clear that our community was just going to be positive. It's kind of easier to be positive in beta, but then when we had millions of people playing the game and like Reddit and other social media platforms all over the world in all different regions are just so positive. And I think, as all of us know as gamers, that's not always true on the internet. There's, not every game is full of such positivity, and I'm really, really blown away and excited about the positivity that is in our community. And so after that moment, after our game had been out for some time and it was clear that this is just the way it's going to be, that was an awesome moment.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, you guys make it really easy to be positive. Like, you guys constantly make changes that are in favor of players. The economy is a huge point for the game. I think is almost undebatable for a lot of people who are, I want to say, moving from other card games and stuff like that. They're trying their best to see what else is out there, and then suddenly at a perfect time, this card game comes along that not only respects your time when you're playing it, but your skill. And I think that's what was really crucial about the positivity that you guys have in this community. It's not just from, oh, it's just a good game. It's a good game that treats its players right. And I think that is the absolutely like crucial element, I think, to why the community has evolved it this way, right? Now, speaking of the community, though, it's a great tie-in. We actually have a bunch of questions from the community. Everyone is super curious about how the sausage gets made, so to speak, and how LOR became this incredible game. So I'm just gonna ask one of these questions. You guys can either take turns answering them or choose whoever gets the best answer on it. But our first question is this. Obviously, League of Legends has a ton of popular champions. What makes you choose which champions make it into the game? Is it their like overall popularity from LOL and other products? Is it the ease of transferring their design, or is it something else entirely?
I think this is a good one for Travis.
Sure, I can give it a shot. It's kind of complicated. There's kind of a priority system we use when making this decision. Riot loves frameworks. The thing that's most important to us is that the game is fun. And so when we're trying out new champions or trying to figure out potential champions to use in each release, we want to pick champions that work together and will make for the most compelling and fun gameplay. So that's like the number one priority. Then we do also consider like how popular has the champion been in League of Legends. Like League of Legends does a lot of research on asking players like which champions they want to see in other games, and we try to take that very seriously. And when we think about the decision, so it's kind of a mix of how popular the champion is, what do players want to see, but that again is secondary because we have learned that just because a champion is not popular in League of Legends does not mean it won't be popular in Legends of Runeterra. As an example, Heimerdinger is not necessarily a very popular champion in League of Legends, but he's been extremely popular in Legends of Runeterra for quite some time. So we're kind of using that less and less, and more just focused on the pure gameplay quality.
Awesome. And I think at least from my perspective as a player, I think one big reason for that is that LOR lets you depict these champions in something just outside of what they are in League of Legends. In League of Legends, they have to be balanced to a MOBA system in a 5v5 fighting game, not fighting game, sorry, in a 5v5 game, so to speak, right? And I think the biggest case example for this will always be Aurelion Sol. Aurelion Sol is almost completely different in terms of function as to what he is in LOR versus what he is in LOL. In LOL, he's depicted as a mighty space dragon. He definitely pursues that on one angle in LOL, but in LOR, you get to see that creation side. He has tons of invoke cards that all are very unique and interesting and have a whole mechanic tied specifically to his creation ability, right? And that is something that allows you as a player to see Aurelion Sol in a new light. And I think that's sort of what happened with Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger, he places down turrets in LOL, and they're functional. But in LOR, he has a giant T-Rex robot, and that's great, you know, and that's something that people can connect to a lot more and give you a different look on what the character really is than just what they appear, what their Q, W, E, and R are in League of Legends, right? Now, speaking of Call of the Mountain as well, what lessons have you guys learned from Call of the Mountain as a whole? This was your first expansion that was released into parts, so to speak. Each one was separated into 3, as opposed to Rising Tides, which was released in mass drop with the original release. What were some lessons you guys learned from this?
So we made the decision to split it into 3 parts pretty far along in the development of it. And so there were, it was designed originally as a package, a complete package, as opposed to 3 drops. I mean, you could see this in some ways where there was cards in the first drop, Call of the Mountain. There's one card, Sparklefly, which you can actually see in the corner of my portrait here, which has Zoe in the art. And Zoe wasn't out in the first drop. Zoe hasn't been out until this week. So I don't know if that's like a particularly useful lesson, but you'll see going forward as we develop the sets with the split in mind, you should see less of those things. I don't know if that's a positive or a negative. I know a lot of the community was aware what champions were in Call of the Mountain anyway, the Targon expansion, because of an unfortunate VO leak we had almost a year ago. So hopefully with the future expansions, they can be more of a surprise, and we'll see if it's a good or a bad thing if the first drop is a little more cohesive and gives less away.
Huge +1. I think another valuable lesson we learned is that we are trying to figure out what is the best for the community and for all of the players on when it comes to the cadence we release content at. You know, historically in this genre, it has been a pattern of like release 300 cards every 3 or 4 months, and that pattern we had this hypothesis that pattern can lead to players not actually playing all of the cards, where they will find the thing that they like and play it for a little while and then stop playing and not explore as much. And as everyone knows in our game, we try to make sure, although it's a little bit impossible, that every card is playable. And so it's even more important to us that players try to explore and learn all the cards. So that's why we initially that's one of the reasons we came up with this idea of like, let's split it up so that we can give players content more frequently, and it still be exciting and they get to explore more of the content. And I think Call of the Mountain was a good evidence that hypothesis is true. And we want to continue releasing content as quickly as possible to make sure it's still fun and engaging, and to allow players to explore every card and every deck if they want to do that, rather than, you know, if you got all of the Call of the Mountain champions at one time, you might only play Riven, or you might only play Soraka. You might not have given Tahm Kench a chance. I'm looking at you, Jake. But because we broke it up and we released them that way, it gave players an opportunity to enjoy the awesome gameplay of Tahm Kench. And I don't think that would have necessarily happened if he was 1 of 13 rather than 1 of 3.
Why are you
Yeah.
laughing? Tahm Kench is great.
Tahm Kench is great, right? So I think something that's really powerful here is like, this is how we also constructed our economy. So we don't want to impose a penalty for players to switch up their decks frequently. So being able to separate out a larger expansion into smaller chunks that can shake up the meta, that we want that to still feel good. Because if, oh, like the deck you're playing is not quite as good now, well, okay, I can just go craft that other thing. That's sweet. As opposed to, wow, I spent 3 months building this deck that's now invalidated. That doesn't feel great. So that gives us a lot more freedom to introduce cards that change things more frequently without making players feel like their time and investment wasn't respected.
Yeah, so I come from a pretty extensive background in card games, and I will tell you right now, the it's a really unfortunate situation when the thing I'm looking forward to in a lot of these expansions is a ban list announcement so that I know that certain things happen, right? But for LOR, it's completely different. When a new deck comes out and I am playing a deck that is just completely bad now because of the meta or whatever, I mean, just let's say less playable. Um, it's not a thing where, well, I just wasted X amount of time of my investment, or worse yet, my money that went into the game. Instead, it's like, okay, I guess I'll open my drawer of literally 100,000 shards, make 3 versions of this deck that I want to play, and now I can go test it myself, right? And that helps so much more for new players as well, because too often does a new player come in here like, how do I spend my shards? And the answer is spend them how you like, experiment, because you're going to get a ton more very quickly. Meanwhile, in say Magic the Gathering, where I'm playing that, I have to be researching which cards and which decks are going to be viable moving forward, because I don't want to make an investment into something that might not be sustainable in the future. But yeah, so next we also have in talk about future expansions. Some champions have proven to work extremely well in future expansions. The best example of this is, I think, Lee Sin and Targon. Even without his buff, it's pretty evident that Targon works incredibly well with him. How far in advance are sets typically planned, and what does the pathway to releasing a set typically look like?
I think Travis and I, and actually and Jake too. Jake will have a lot of insight here, but we work on stuff very, very far in advance of releasing it. It takes a really long time to develop a set from the beginning of like, we have what we call DNA pods at the beginning, design narrative art, where the initial design works really closely with a concept art partner and a narrative partner, and they make the set as a little triangle together. So all the way from the beginnings of that to working with our partners on what we call our PXM team, our player expression and metagame team, working with them about how they do the region road expansions. As we have sets in the future that are going to be different formats, we need to work more closely with them to make sure that they're prepared to handle that. So these are things that are years in the making, depending on what part of the set that you're looking at. Considering how currently released content will interact with future content is definitely something that the teams look at. I believe I can't remember if we actually did it. Travis, maybe you can speak to this, but I know we were looking at how Ezreal would interact with Targon and making some decisions about that as well, since there were cheap spells you could play, and we didn't want Ezreal to get
Gems and the like,
fun
yeah.
thing to play against. Yeah,
Mm-hmm,
gems.
mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. So that rambly answer, but yeah, we work on stuff for years before it gets to players, and we definitely try and take a look at what players currently have available and how that interacts with fresh content.
Yeah, to add to that a little bit, I think that to maybe crystallize it a little, right now we know which champions are going to be released to players in the full first half year of 2022. Like they're being developed right
Wow.
now. We are we play test them every week already, and that's still over a year and a half away. So it's pretty far in advance. It creates some challenges, but it also lets us do exactly what you're calling out of like right now we can play the champions that are in that release with the champions that are live or the champions that are coming out in between now and then. So uh, we do have a lot of play testing with, like, to use your example with like Lee Sin in set 3 before set 3 comes out. We do that quite frequently, and because of our business model, we are able to change cards very easily,
Mm.
and not have to worry about like, is this overtuned? So to use Jenny's example of Ezreal, there were some question marks that he might be in the orange zone, not necessarily a red zone, but we prefer to let things like that happen and see like what the players will do, because honestly, the community is better than we will ever be, and they're better at finding out what strategies are powerful and fun. So we like to see what players will do, and then if we overtune something or undertune something, as you've seen, we're very happy to make changes.
Yeah, and this even applies the cosmetic and personalization level. So We want to figure out what emotes, what deck bundles, all these things will be exciting to players, and we're definitely leading into the meme space because players love it and it's great. But figuring out what characters are in those sets, whether it's champion or non-champion, how do we get like a range of feelings, emotions? How do we get a range of human characteristics, like in terms of gender and skin tone diversity? Like we want to represent our players in a bajillion different ways, and because emotes are the way you talk in game, they're like they
Yeah.
are your they're your verbs.
The closest thing we
So
have, yeah.
right. So like we need to give you good verbs to use.
Yeah, I gotta say, like when Nocturne first came out, I'm a huge fan of fearsome aggro types in general. But as soon as I saw he had the meme face from Yu-Gi-Oh, I was like, this thing I'm buying instant. As soon as I grab it, because this is amazing. I think this also goes for things such as the Zon board and card back that just came out as well. Not necessarily complain, but people are noticing that a lot of the Piltover Zon cosmetics were very much on the Piltover side and not so much on the Zon side, because they do have two very genuinely different aesthetics. And I think it's so fitting that Victor, obviously a very prolific Zonite character, comes with him a bunch of great Zon cosmetics. So that's been great. So another, speaking of which, will there ever be merch specifically for LOR? Just for an example, I want to hold an IRL Precious Pet in my hand on a card, okay? That is my personal dream. Or a poster of him on my wall, that would also work. Because the art is incredible, right? Like the art has some of the most incredible art I've ever seen. The warrior art, from the Celestial, is gorgeous. It's like a full spread. I'd love to have it over my monitor or something, right? Are we ever going to have the option to do that, hypothetically?
So the team that makes merch at Riot is its own team, and they work with the game teams. I know that we've had one official piece of merch so far with the lore closed beta bomber jacket.
Yep, immediately bought it.
Me too. I can't wait for it to arrive. We have been talking to them about what future merch might look like. But beyond that, that's all I got for you for now. I would love just like any of our poros. Like, give me a little plucky poro with a helmet, so I can just like cuddle that every night, or spooky poro, or
spooky
sorry,
poro.
sinister poro. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me any of them. But yeah, for now, yeah, that's all we got. Sorry.
No, totally fair. As long as it's being discussed, at least I am happy, because maybe one day, now that's what I'm here for. So here's an interesting one. What interesting cards or card concepts were thrown around during the designing of the game, either from initial or even from some of these sets that we've now seen, such as Call of the Mountain? If you remember any.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I can answer this question, although we get this question a lot, and honestly, I know that the answer is very unsatisfying, because there are champion concepts that we haven't used yet that we like brainstormed and came up with, and we generally don't like to share that they didn't come out, because we might use them again. We might actually like bring them back to use them for a future champion. So the answer to this question isn't really fun. However, I'll tell you something that we'll never do. So I'll tell you a concept that we know we'll never do, which is a long time ago, Katarina's ability used to be when she attacked, she did 1 damage to all other units in combat for every spell you cast. So you could attack with Katarina, and your opponent was just like, they never were allowed to block Katarina while you had mana, because if they did, you would cast 3 spells and suddenly their whole board is obliterated. We quickly realized that we probably can just never make a mechanic like that, because it's too hard on the defending player, and it's like, hey, don't block. So things like that, we have definitely learned some lessons like that. Another lesson we've learned that we probably will never do is mechanics that require your opponent to click OK a bunch in a row. Like if you have 10, like if you had, let's say we made a spell that gave you 10 cards in your hand that caused 0, and they did something, then you would cast each of them, and your opponent has to sit there and do nothing and click OK and click OK and click OK. So we were going to stay away from mechanics like that, and there definitely was a mechanic like that once upon a time, where we got a bunch of free cards in your hand, and your opponent just sat there for a whole 2 minutes clicking OK while they didn't do anything.
Well, I have to imagine that's actually what the quote-unquote gem speed cards are actually based upon fixing, right? Because we have, I think, Gifts from the Mountain, I believe is the name of the card, where it just fills your hand with gems. And if I had hit OK 10 times as my opponent plays out gems on an elusive 2/3, I'm just going to be like, all right, man, look, I'm just going to concede. It's not even worth watching this.
Yeah.
So
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so we found a way. Game design. The designers on our team are so incredible, and they found a way to allow us to do that with burst spells. Um, but if we ever wanted to use a mechanic that targeted the opponent's units, we couldn't do that. Right? There's very few burst abilities that are. It's okay to let your opponent interact, like to do things to your opponent. So yeah, that's like our one cheat to
mhm.
let players cast a bunch of free cards.
We
Yeah,
also
and
had
that.
a.
No, sorry.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Okay. Uh,
Please go.
the Canadian standoff. Oh man. Sorry, apologies for that. So that's sort of like where things such as warning shot, risen mists, that sort of effects, where they're effects that don't really require the opponent to have an option, so to speak, on whether or not they get played or not. They just happen. I can see that why that definitely happens, especially for gems or I believe help picks was a really big one for that as well, because if you were to hypothetically attack with it, having the threat of it was actually more powerful than actually ever using it, which means that the opponent just can't do anything, which is definitely sort of, I can see what you mean for that for sure.
Yeah, barrier being burst is in some ways like it didn't used to be burst, and it was almost kind of a nerf to make it burst. Even though I think it's in a really good state because you can't put it into the stack and like decide, oh, I'm gonna block this first mystic. I don't know, mystic. They both do 2 damage, whatever. Bad
Yeah,
example.
misdraw. Yeah,
But you can't decide what you block with it. It just always is the same. One other thing that I remembered we had with Lee Sin, his Dragon's Rage kick. You used to do um, the unit that got kicked power would be the thing that damaged the Nexus. So
interesting.
you would get like sort of if you had a really big swole squirrel, for example, you could get punished with your own giant squirrel. And there was like one internal playtest where that happened, and we were like, "Oh, we're changing that. That's not shipping. That was not
Yeah,
fun."
it's just not fun to get punished for what your own decision was on that. I can
Yeah.
see that. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. One actually interesting part of that as well, I thought I mentioned is that I help sort of head up the custom cards section of LOR. So I do a lot of these like custom designs and stuff like that. And I swear it's every other week where someone prints or shows us fast speed frostbite. And I'm like, wait a second, that just doesn't work because of how the stack works. A fast speed frostbite makes it untouchable. You can't do anything to it because if you were to do any buffs to it, it makes it impossible to counteract. For those of you watching, burst speed for silence, for barrier, and frostbite, I believe, are the 3 main ones. Where if they were to be fast speed, they would actually be incredibly more powerful and almost like people complain about like, oh, I hate getting my guy frostbitten at burst speed. Trust me, you do not want it at fast speed. At least this gives you an opportunity, right? Okay, so let's go to the next question here. Look, I love Ash. I do. But will we ever get a new loading screen? If that's even remotely possible.
Would that be your team, Jake?
It might be.
I don't know if it's
Yeah,
on their radar though.
it is something we've actually talked about before, on and off.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, it is a non-trivial lift to get something that's really sweet and really hit that bar of, hey, you're going to see this every time you log in. Um, what should that experience be? It's something that could happen at some point, but I can say it's not very high on our list currently, but you never know.
Well, actually, I want to speak about things you're going to see quite often. I was bringing my friend in who just started playing League of Legends, and then Targon had just been
Welcome.
released, right? Yeah, and so I was like, "Hey, come watch me play LOR," because he comes from a Magic background as well. And this was the first day of the Targon expansion, and so when I opened it up, it had the Targon little symbol there, and I'm like, "What's this?" And I clicked on it, and we were just blown away by the most crazy load-in animation I've ever seen in my life. Like, it did all the stars, then the meteor started falling and panned out to Tarek. I'm like, okay, I guess that's the standard moving forward. I guess that's incredible. And that sort of thing, like to do really truly special things like that, I can see what you mean. It takes an extra like level of care and probably unfortunately a little bit more resources than it can probably happen all the time.
That's the other thing is also memory, because we ship on a phone, so we
Yeah,
have some pretty tight constraints on what we can
yeah.
ship for this, especially for these motion graphics, because we want to make sure that your experience on a phone is just as good as your experience on a PC.
And because that also goes double for level up animations, which have increasingly gotten more and more like dramatic and crazy as we go on. Riven's animation is mind blowing that I can even run on my old phone, so I'm incredibly happy about that. Actually, here's a really interesting one, especially as we move into the next expansions. Obviously, we don't know what the hypothetical region 9 and 10 are going to be yet. We just know that they are apparently coming from the new region graphic that you showed us. The question on everyone's mind, you don't have to tell us which ones we're going to be getting, but how do you guys choose which regions get represented into the game? Because we have Piltover and Zon were put into one region, which, I mean, technically they really should have always been there, always work well together anyways. But I believe we have 4 official on the region page regions remaining. Are we going to have 12 regions? Is every region getting represented? Which one's coming next? Like, how do you guys choose which ones go in?
I'm happy to answer this one. First of all, we are not going to have 12 regions. We're going to have 10. That's public information. So in the coming year, in 2021, at the end of the year, we will have our 10 final regions of our game. As far as how we choose the regions, it's really complicated. Like you mentioned, Piltover and Zon. One of the reasons that we decided to merge Piltover and Zon is because we felt like our game is focused on story and focused on the world of Runeterra, and Piltover and Zon are the same city. They're like 2 different regions. It's like a vertical city where all of the rich aristocrats live in the upper echelons, which is Piltover, and then like all of the impoverished, like less fortunate people. Or madness people like Victor and Dr. Mundo live in the bottom part of the city, which is Zon. And so we wanted to really bring the world of Runeterra to life, and so that's why those 2 are together. The biggest factors that determine like which regions we would choose or not choose were 2 things. One, like, what do we think can be the most compelling story? Like, which champions have the most compelling stories, and interactions and things like that. And then the second thing is like, and somewhat it was pre-described by the number of champions. Like there was no way we would make our game and not have Demacia. There are too many Demacian champions. There is no way we would make our game and not have Piltover and Zon. There are too many champions, right?
There's so many. I didn't realize how many there are.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. Especially when we go into the new ones coming up. People always have their favorites. Literally in the Discord, it's every day we have people jousting over the last 4 remaining. So we're super excited to sort of see that happen. But interestingly enough, we're now seeing, especially with the advent of Rune King and stuff like that, where we're seeing champions move well outside of their usual regions, right? Yasuo, Ahri, and Braum are not typically described internally to you as Bilgewater or Shadow Isles champions, right? So the interesting question is this: if we are going to only have 10 regions, assumedly 2 of the regions left aren't going to be in the game officially. How will they be split up? Or will we see more engaging stories like we're seeing in Rune King to explain why champions are going to a new location? Or how do you guys sort of imagine that sort of happening?
Another great question. There is this idea of like a champion being from a region, but doesn't mean that they stay there 100% of the time. Like Teemo, he wanders around Runeterra, and so when Teemo was introduced into our game, he happens to be in Piltover and Zon, but he doesn't live there. He was just there during that moment in time, right? Similarly, Riven and
Riven was a big
Yasuo,
example.
Yeah, they are champions that wander all over the place. So there are quite a few regions. There's actually more than 2 regions that won't be in our game, because I think that there are like 15 official regions on the Riot universe page, but yeah, it will be executions like that where champions are wandering around or they have a reason as part of the story. I think the call out you had of Yasuo and Ahri going with Braum through Bilgewater is an excellent example. We want to tell stories like that, and the story will help us determine and world build why this champion happens to be in this region at this time. Of course, there are some examples where that just isn't possible. Like Garen is Demacian. That's it. Like Garen is always going to be in Demacia. Similar for like Jarvan the Fourth. Like he's the prince of Demacia. Like he's always going to be in Demacia. Like probably always going to be in Demacia. But for most champions, I would say 90% of champions, there's a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, especially when those champions have like a core attribute really focused on that initial region. Like Karma is a really big one who has a really strong cultural tie to Ionia, for example. So it makes a lot of sense for her to be there and so on. Thank you so much for that. Now, here's a bit more of an interesting one from my group over in the custom group of people. how do you guys decide which cards are which rarities? We've been trying our best to nail down like a consistent pattern on that. Originally it was like, oh, complex cards are epics, but then we have like Avaros and Hearthguard, who's mostly like just a pretty simple effect, but it's powerful. So we're just curious, like, what sort of internal rules do you guys use? Is it for expeditions? Is there some sort of cohesiveness to it? What are you guys sort of feeling?
Another good one for Travis.
I mean, I can answer this question, but I also think Jake probably has good insight here. It's complicated because when we think about other games in our genre, they primarily use rarity for their business model, which doesn't work in our game.
That's
And so it is kind of the two things you called out, which is complexity, where there are exceptions, like the Hearthguard is a good exception, but generally we try to make cards that are common less complicated because we know that that's going to be the most amount of cards and cards players use the most, and we don't want the game to be too complicated. So it's our like funnel for like champions to be the most complicated and commons to be the least complicated, as well as we do consider it for the expeditions, like you said, because we don't want to, if a card is very powerful, we don't want it to be in a common slot to where like it's in
every
like
bucket.
if it common exactly, like if Bannerman, if Vanguard Bannerman was common in limited or in expedition, it would take over expeditions where every time you were Demacian, if you had 4 of those cards, it would be insurmountable for your opponent. So that's another axis we care about.
Yeah, that's all like really awesome information, and the complexity is a big piece of it. If we like look back at where a rarity came from, a lot of it is actually rooted in expeditions for those very same reasons of like how often do we want these things to occur. Because there was actually a time before we launched when we were iterating on business models and figuring out how exactly we wanted to present cards that there actually wasn't rarity on cards other than champions. So you had champions and non-champions, and on the back end for expeditions, it had this concept of common, rare, and epic for how frequently you'd be offered a card, but it wasn't actually really on the cards in any meaningful way. And then over time, we decided that actually the rarity does make sense as a lens for our players. But if you compare the especially commons or even rares in lore to other games, a lot more of them are playable. So kind of below epic, common and rare, there is definitely a complexity difference there, and like we have sheets for evaluating complexity of different rarities when we're working on releasing a set. But compared to a lot of other games, our common rare gap is a lot smaller. Our commons are a little bit closer to uncommons for other games.
Yeah, I think one thing to really make a note of, especially when it comes to those things, is that in many other card games, rarity is almost seen as a balancing decision in many ways, where the highest rarity cards might not even be complex, but rather just incredibly efficient. And they use this as a justification so that when we get into the say like limited formats, right, that some player doesn't open up 5 of them, which is a similar concept here. But the issue with that in a physical card game, unlike our economy here, is that it leads to playable decks costing upwards of $700, and that's just not sustainable for a standard period rotation, right? Now, actually, just speaking of rotation, as I like sort of get to that, rotation is something that is almost seen as a creeping inevitability in a lot of card games, because not necessarily because of power creep all the time, but in this game where we noticed that it is incredibly balanced. There are some the difference of playable cards comparatively to other card games is so vastly different that we're some of us at least are a little concerned, like, how is this going to happen for when rotation happens? Our champion's going to rotate. Our champion's going to see new forms, perhaps. When Yasuo moves from Ionia to Bilgewater, as he's doing now, is that a sign to eventually get a Yasuo in a pirate hat? You know, like I'm truly curious about this. What are your ideas for what these cards could look like in the future when they start hitting rotations and stuff like that?
I can answer this question if that's okay. It's a complicated issue, and our game, like players are used to having this concept of rotation because of systems from other games that don't exist in our game. As you called out, we work very hard to keep our game relatively balanced, and also we are not necessarily trying to sell as many randomized packs with powerful new cards that are powerful than the cards that came before it. So we don't have that same like pressure for power creep.
Mhm.
Also, we actually have an opposite pressure where we try to make sure that our champions are all playable. And that
Mhm.
definition is a little bit loose. I do know that as soon as I say that and people hear that, they're going to be like, "What about Timo and his
X-Guard, yeah,
47% win rate or whatever?"
yeah.
Like, but that pressure makes it so that when we come out with Riven, that it doesn't mean you automatically stop playing Draven. We want both of those champions to exist. We want all of the Noxian champions to be able to exist in the same ecosystem. And so, as Jake kind of called out in his last answer, the power level across multiple champions in our game is relatively flat. And we like that. We think that's good because it lets players continue to play their cards. Um, when we do move into the future, we have multiple formats. Um, it won't necessarily be because we want to make a new Yasuo or whatever. It will mostly be because at that time there will be new players, and when they're joining the game, it will be too hard to learn what 120 different champions do or 150 different champions do. And so we will try to create a format that is more focused on newer cards so that players can learn. But we do have a core pillar that we take very seriously, which is if you have cards that you love in our game, we want you to always to be able to play them. So there will be a format where every card is legal. And that format will probably be the primary format where like you can play Yasuo. Like I hope in 2023 people are still playing Yasuo decks. I hope that's still a real thing. To me, that would be a signal of success that we have done the thing we wanted to do because we didn't power creep ourselves into oblivion. Now that is a very ambitious goal. And that's pretty far away. So I don't want to like make a promise that we're doing that thing, but that is something we are trying to do. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and I think that is like admirable at the very least. Many too often times in other CCGs, because of the business model, which it always comes back to this, honestly, is that the eternal formats are seen as impossible to monetize, and therefore they are therefore then abandoned. And too often is it then it feels often that those formats just get completely fell to the wayside. And if you actually want to get content, you have to play the current rotation, so to speak. And I think one thing that's really been great about the cards that sort of gives me faith for this is that we're seeing cards that get added in later expansions that specifically tie to other cards. Slaughterdox, for example, has no real synergy with Tom Kench. I mean, I'm sure you could do it if you really wanted to. He's very much made for Nautilus, right? And that is sort of proof that even as new cards will come out, at least to me, I'm happy knowing that we'll probably continue to get Yasuo support as long as stun cards are ever printed, and that is, I'm sure is going to be many years into the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is absolutely something we pay attention to. Coming from League, League is a very big game with a lot of players all over the world. So even the less popular champions still have so many human beings who are attached to them that it's important to us to get to realize that fantasy in a new format and to make sure that they're not, abandoned. Just like in League, where one champion is super meta for one season and then they fall off and then they're back in 2 years. We want to find new ways to refresh it and make it fun. And Aurelion Sol is a great example. Like we talked about a little bit earlier with him being so expensive and so powerful. It's like we really wanted to realize his narrative fantasies in some ways, where he's like, this is a star forging god dragon. And he's fun to play in League. He's got a unique play style in League. That it can be really good at especially at high levels of play. But I don't know, to me, if he feels like Star Forging God Dragon in League. Whereas then I feel like we realized, that aspect of him in lore.
That fantasy, so to speak,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so to let that expire and to let that like in a couple expansions be irrelevant would be really sad.
Especially with how much I want to say how should I put this? How much polish goes into so many of these champions as well, not just from like a voice lines interaction standpoint, but from the animations. Level up animations are getting, at least in my opinion, increasingly more impressive as we go along, and as well as the champion spells themselves. I nearly screamed when I saw Lee Sin reference an April Fool's joke from like 8 years ago. I'm like, really? We're finally doing it? We can finally kick someone to the Nexus and win the game? Like things like that were really evocative to me, and like that's the true downside of of a rotation in a game like this where the card quality is so high is that it feels like you're going to lose so much, because normally when a set rotates in other card games, it does feel like you only lose maybe 10 cards sometimes, right? But in this one, I would hate to lose anything. So I'm really glad to hear that we'll still be able to at least play them at the very least. Here's actually an interesting question for in terms of cosmetics. Prismatics just launched, and it is, I have to say, some of them on like the landmarks in particular are gorgeous. They are like, the frame is just incredible. Now, how much more can you guys see? Like, are we getting other different types of prismatics? Are there some other ways we can get them besides the quest? I know you guys have included them in ranked rewards, but one thing that a lot of people sort of mentioned was that the the path to progress on a seasonal tournament is tied through a ladder, which is one, but the other one was Gauntlet Prime Glories. Could we perhaps see that be an option to get prismatics as well as in the future? Because that's follows the similar thing of not being able to grind so much on ladder, but you still want to be rewarded for playing well. What are some of your thoughts on more prismatic stuff?
Yeah, so I'm happy to take that. So prismatics is definitely, this is the first step of many. What that shape will eventually look like largely depends on what players like. I mean, we didn't want to commit to launching a bunch of different product lines for prismatics up front if we weren't sure they were going to resonate with players. But as we get experience on that and see how players enjoy this, what play patterns they have, that's going to inform those decisions of where we would go with that. Um, but on the Gauntlet side, we currently do have some of that. So in addition to ranked rewards, there are 3 recurring quest lines
Hmm.
every month, and one of those is you can earn prismatics in gauntlets or expeditions, and that's
Yes,
actually a, yeah, right. So that's a 3-part quest, and that actually the third um, quest of that particular quest chain actually has like the highest tier epic prismatic chests as rewards. But yeah, that's something we do want to explore, finding different ways to make that really exciting. And if we're not quite there, we'll iterate and continue to polish it and make it even more fun.
yeah, that's actually really awesome to mention. I genuinely, I hadn't played Expeditions in nearly forever. I really do like the format a lot, but I just hadn't had time, unfortunately. I grind a lot of the ladder most of the time. But seeing that it specifically called out Expeditions, I'm like, hey, you know what? I'll pop back in, try it out again. And I think that was really great for me to sort of really appreciate that format again. Because Expeditions, especially when the game came out in beta, to hear that you get 2 trials, constant drafting in and out was a huge, huge part of that of the reason why I loved it back then. I'm just glad I made time for it again. And these were like a great encouragement for it, because they do really look stunning, and I'm really happy that they're there for it. One thing I also do want to call out though is that like I'm getting increasingly impressed with how many cosmetics you guys give us for free. For example, the region card backs. Those are prime real estate, so to speak, to getting monetized in any other sort of game or card game, so to speak. But instead, here they were given to us just for being devoted to a region effectively by grinding out 3 XP. We're seeing that now with icons, and now with the prismatic borders are a great example of this. You can just get them just by playing the game, just by playing ranked even. Like that is just a great sort of translation of the League of Legends get to gold, get X skin chroma type sort of system. I assume that was sort of what the parallel was there. But yeah, thank you so much for that.
Sure.
As we,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Hearthstone gives out card backs too. Every ranked season, you get a
Oh
free
yeah, that's true.
card
That's
back
true.
from Hearthstone.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, that's very true. Speaking of which, I'm not sure if this is in your department, because I know you mentioned them sort of externally. The Region Road, it's getting impressive how many more things get put onto it as in terms of like more borders, more icons now. I don't know how much more you guys can add. What are some thoughts of like what you could see moving on in the future for that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Do you mean more in terms of like the rewards there, or the length of it, or something in between?
Oh, I mean, more so the awards. I mean, I assume the length hypothetically could grow forever. I know you guys do this catch-up EXP type thing, where if new players come onto a road, they can quickly catch up to where everyone else is with increased EXP gains up to a certain point. I believe that was the exact phrasing of it. I haven't had to use it myself, so I'm sorry. But like, I assume that that's what the similar would be, fixing the length, so to speak, which is simply increasing the variable of that going forward. Speaking more so the rewards then.
Yeah, so we're trying to support every champion as they come out, which is really convenient the way we structure our sets.
Hmm.
So when we expand, say, Demacia Road in set 3, we can put Shyvana there and give you Shyvana related cards, which is really sweet. Like on the, like, not to get super nerdy on the tech side, but if I, for all of our rewards and loot, if I say give me set 3 Demacia, it gives me Shyvana followers, because that's what the set 3 Demacia stuff is. So it makes it really convenient for players to be able to see, oh, there's a picture of Shyvana here, and I'm getting cards that make sense with Shyvana. And that feels really good. So that's something we're exploring more of, and say like, okay, well, do players like rewards of this framing? Is Region Road the best format for that? We're always open to figuring out what ways to iterate. Region Road is a very large system, so like any changes would come there would take quite a bit of time. But yeah, like basically anything that's not quite doing what we want, we're happy to iterate on. Right now, we're reasonably happy with region rewards, but like maybe in 2022 when the sets are very large, we might look at that again and say, well, we've got so many different things, or if we want to have players able to pursue the newest content separately, maybe we would reevaluate that.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I also wanted to talk about in terms of releases and schedules recently was the Kda Card Drop. I just want to say that out of the 5 of them, they were very clearly build around concepts. And as someone who really enjoys deck building like myself, I think I made at least probably 8 go get it different decks, right? And the fact that one card edition is able to like persuade me to make that much of a difference in terms of cards was really big for me. I understand that like sets will continue to be released as normal, but what about these mid-set drops? Even just like 2-3 very, very I don't want to say inspirational cards, like cards that drive you to create these incredibly different decks. What are your guys' sort of vision? Was this a success for you guys? Do you want to see these sort of small drops happen in the future?
This is your baby, Travis. Go ahead.
It's hard to answer because I don't want to spoil stuff in the future,
Totally
but
fair.
I can say that we're really excited about the KDA event and the success that the KDA event had. And a huge amount of players loved it, both from the gameplay perspective and from the cosmetic perspective. I mean, KDA is sick. I love it so much. So we definitely do want to try to do more things like that in the future. But we learn from everything we do. Like we learn from Spirit Blossom and we learn from KDA, and we're going to keep trying to improve with every release we have. So all that, I guess, to say TLDR is like we do want to try to do things like that in the future. They probably won't look exactly the same, but we're not as sure exactly. But I can't say exactly what they will look
Of
like
course,
without spoiling things
fair.
we don't want to.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
it's nice to hear that was that inspired so many new decks out of you. Like that feels really good to hear. I know Jake and Jake's team put a lot of work into the event surrounding it, and reflecting on a lot of community feedback from Spirit Blossom. So you can definitely, Jake can talk more about that, but you can definitely, the changes you saw between Spirit Blossom and KDA, that's a pattern of behavior that the lore team would like to continue, is getting community feedback, reflecting, and making sure that that those learnings are passed forward to future content.
Yeah.
Totally. Sorry, Jake. I just saw a comment that there was a pause where I was like trying to answer the question without not answering the question. Clear that the pause was actually me being a dum dum and trying to figure out how to unmute myself. I tried to give the most honest answer I could. Go ahead, Jake.
No,
Sorry.
you're fine. One of the biggest iterations from Spirit Blossom to KDA that I wanted to highlight is really plays to our core philosophy of we want players to play the way they want to play. So we didn't have like very great options in Spirit Blossom for players that mostly played PvE versus AI to progress. And that actually led us to this moment where we realized, oh, we actually have a decent number of our players, like a pretty sizable chunk that really enjoy versus AI is one of their main ways of playing, and we want to support them because if they're playing the game, they should feel rewarded. So for KDA, we actually made the progress a little bit easier for those AI players, and want to make sure that they feel that their game mode is legitimate, and that's what our promise in terms of any game mode we have. We want players. If you're a labs only player, if you're an expedition only player, any future formats we have with different slices of cards, if that's your game, we want it to feel good for you.
And I think one really big part about that, I believe that was also at the same time as our first ever PvE lab, I believe. And that was, I have to say, that gave me some like Slay the Spire vibes. I was having a ton of fun, like sort of going up against a PvE, almost like a trials run, almost so to speak. It was a really great experience because it allowed you to not only tell like mini stories for each of these characters, but also let the player be overpowered and do a new sort of deck construction type element, right? How are those seen as from Riot's perspective? I know that just recently it was brought back along with the KDA one, which to me signals its success. But how did you guys feel about the first PVE lab?
We were happy with it. It was super fun to work on in terms of having more of a storied mode to it. And the engagement was good, and yeah, we're looking um, to explore new ways to explore content in lore in the future, and to try and appeal to different groups of players. So I feel like the lore team did a lot to focus on competitive players this year with the seasonal tournaments, which is amazing. But not every player is super competitive, so we want to make sure that we're serving all players as much as is possible. So you can definitely look for more explorations and expansions in the future.
Awesome. I'm really excited to see what hypothetical more challenges like that, PvE challenge like that might happen in the future as well. Actually, I had an interesting question about this, just to understand the distinction here, so to speak. For the cosmetic effects in the game, one big hypothetical one that a lot of people typically talk about is the animations of cards themselves. So, for example, with the KDA event, we saw what could be the first ever cosmetic effects in the game with the cards are effectively level up animations, very very small ones, so to speak, but they're really really flashy and really really interesting. Is that something you could see cosmetics hypothetically looking into in the future? These changes in animation.
It's something that we've considered, and it's come up a lot actually internally as well.
Mm,
There are some tricky barriers along the way. One of them is those animations take a lot of time and care to build. So if we ever did move forward on that, it would have to be a pretty premium price point, and we want to make sure our cosmetics are accessible to players. So that's something we have to balance. And then there's also a question of gameplay clarity that we have to be careful with. We want to serve a lot of different player fantasies, but if let's say you're used to playing Swain and suddenly the level up animation is totally different and he's got like dragons or something because it's Dragon Master Swain. You're like, okay, well, what actually happened here? So we want to balance that, being able to let you express yourself in these really cool ways, but also to not impede game clarity. And all that's to say, like that's not off the table, but it's a pretty tricky problem space that we're still interested in, but we have currently nothing on the roadmap of like, yes, we're definitely doing this.
of
It's more
course.
like, this is cool. Can we find a way to do it? We're not actually sure.
Because I think one thing that is at least a somewhat significant barrier to entry for new players in League of Legends is understanding that, hey, when Lee Sin throws a Sonic Wave at you, if it's blue, red, pink, or green, what does that mean, right?
Right.
And that is like, unfortunately, like, because of how the debt of the game has sort of been, is that you can't go back and delete skins, obviously. But in this case, since we're starting from the ground up, I appreciate that sort of cadence and understanding that this could be something to, at least especially in a card game, which is so based on information, it is going to be a little more important in those situations. Speaking of which, though, for future cosmetics, the cosmetics we have right now are amazing and really really great. For the boards in particular, we have. One thing I really wanted to point out is that a lot of them are opt-in only, especially for these clarity things. So, for example, if I don't want my board to look like a Noxian Arena, my opponent's Noxian Arena board is specifically cut off at the halfway point, so my board remains as clean, so to speak, as I want it to be. Same thing with the Guardians, and same thing with basically the Prismatics as well, which are obviously also opt-in. When it comes to the future of the game overall, in terms of a lot of these designs and aspects, what do you sort of see? How should I put this? Um, do you see more cosmetics coming out for the ranked reward side of things, or other ways to reward players beyond just say the singular icon? Not to say like that's, and obviously Prismatics was one of them, which was a great step towards that. But I think one issue a lot of players had was when we get to say masters with one icon, I actually might prefer the aesthetic of the platinum icon or the silver icon because it just happens to match a color scheme that's more suitable to my preferences, right? Masters is always like this pink color, which is great, but I personally like that green platinum color a bit more. So will that ever be an option hypothetically?
That's a really great question, and it's actually something that's come up. Like you actually see this in League quite a bit, where players enjoy flashing their low mastery when they
Yeah.
have it, but like over time they don't get that anymore, and it's actually kind of a loss. Like sometimes you enjoy styling on someone with your low mastery champ that you actually know how to play really well. Um, I think that's it's a tricky space, but I think there's some really cool solutions that we're at least exploring, ways of letting you show off your historical achievements or things like that, so that maybe it won't be an icon, but at least maybe there's some other like elements that you can set or other things you can show, like like to express that. And to your point about boards, one of the reasons we wanted to do that is I don't want like if you play on Noxian Arena and I bought like this sweet arcade board, I still want to be able to see it because
Mm.
the most resonant, the most successful cosmetic content is stuff that you can show off. If it only lives in like a profile page somewhere, it's probably not going to do as well. So we want to try and find those channels where you can express yourself as a player to your opponent, because that's really what's cool and feels good.
Hmm. And actually, to that point as well, the one time where that's not the case is in labs, where you have like these very specifically designed boards that are often built on being symmetrical. I believe the Kda one literally has Kda across the middle, which would be literally impossible to do if that was the case. But here's the question though, especially for some of the labs that had really nice music in the background. One thing a lot of players sort of note is that the music of these boards are really great. I was a huge fan of the instrumental Get Jinx that plays on Jinx's board, for example. But let's say I don't want to use Jinx's board, but I want to use her music. Will that mix opportunity ever happen for it? Let's say you own a board with the music, but you want to play it on this board instead with that original one's music.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, we actually hadn't thought of that. That's a cool idea. I don't actually know what the tech stack for that would look like. It might be easy, it might be super hard, but
Hmm.
like that like as an option setting is kind of cool. And like over time, we do hope to generally give players more options to customize their experience, whether it's something like this or something totally different. But yeah, that's an interesting idea. Hadn't
Yeah,
really
no,
thought about that.
no worries. Yeah, it's something that I was really sort of looking forward to for a lot of these boards when they come out. Is like I get to hear like these really cool renditions of typically the champion's theme in the case of Jinx here. But it's definitely something that at least I was personally really interested in. Now, speaking about the level up animations, actually, is that more on the cosmetic side, or is that considered a different entire branch of like the champion design team? Actually,
So for sets, when we say sets, we mean the holistic package, at least on the gameplay side. So that means the card illustration, that means the card design, that means the narrative in terms of VO and flavor text and final card name, and that means the level ups and spell moments, which are made by our realization team, which are like a sub team of the great sets pipeline. And so our realization team works on the champion level ups and the key high moments. So that might be, of course, now I'm totally blanking on a non level up moment. Lee Sin's
Dragon
Dragon
Kick.
Rage kick.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got a special animation for that. Or Judgment, because
Mhm.
Judgment is a really big spell if
Yeah,
you
the
get blown
spin
up by it.
sword.
You're
Yeah,
like, "Ah!"
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's our realization team, and it's a what we call a cross-discipline team. It has a couple different disciplines, which are like crafts. They've got rigging and animation, and 3D modeling and visual design, and they've got concept art as well. And of course, there's QA and sound design as well. So they all work together towards the end of the set development once design is pretty locked, once card art is coming in, final card art. They will put those moments together.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's I think it's pretty clear, at least from at least my perspective, how much quality goes into some of these animations. Even things such as I personally don't see it's played as frequently as it probably should be. Is Katarina's spinning knife move? I can't remember her champion spell. It looks gorgeous every single time I see it. I'm like, wow, that is a really nice animation for that card. And it's really incredible, especially when you start seeing even unique animations that you wouldn't even consider. Mind Meld has a unique animation if you cast it at 0. I had no idea. I was like, wow, they really thought of everything in case someone just happened to want to blow up their own board, that there's an option for that. And that sort of spoke to my understanding, like how much you guys really care about the quality for these cards. So thank you so much for that. Especially as like these cards are doing some really great things. The idea of a lot of these champions having interactions is a really big selling point for the game overall. And as you mentioned earlier, unfortunately, due to leaks, we didn't know about a lot of these ahead of the time. But that was interesting because that also led to a fan theory that Tiari was going to be a representation for trans people moving forward into the game. And a lot of us had heard the voice lines, especially the cadence, especially the exact vocabulary. It was very evident to anyone remotely connected to that sort of issue that we thought that was really important and that was going to be incredible. And when it actually came out and it was actually realized, it was amazing. For inclusion in those sort of things in LOR, I think it's pretty evident, for at least from a lot of people from our perspective, it's a lot more easy to see in LOR than it is in LOL. What are some of your considerations that go towards making that possible? Because it's been a huge thing for a lot of us players.
Yeah, Jake's group has a lot to do with this. I can't speak to League; they're a different team, different product. But for lore, building an authentic, believable world in Runeterra, making sure that there are lots of different people who can see themselves reflected in a video game, especially if they haven't seen themselves like positively reflected before. That was really, really important to our narrative and art teams, and every team, but narrative and art has a unique
A big
opportunity
say
to
on it,
express
yeah,
it.
yeah.
And so some of the things we've done are consult with what we call rigs, Riot identity groups, and that they are groups composed of rioters who fall into certain identity categories. We've got Riot Noir, for example, which is Black and African American rioters. We've got Rainbow Rioters, which is our LGBTQ rioters, and we've got the Rad Genders rig, which is a Riot identity group composed of people of a variety of genders. And so one of the things that we did for Tiari, and I say we because I was on the narrative team, but I want to make it clear that there was so much more work put into this, especially by Rowan Williams and Jake and Jules Glegg on working on Tiari. But we really wanted Tiari to be an authentic expression. And so there was a lot of work put into talking to the groups to make sure that it felt realistic and aspirational as a depiction, and then working closely with the voice actress as well, and making sure that she was okay with voicing Tiari as a character in a couple different stages of their life and their transition, and that felt good for her. And yeah, we're so happy that that resonated. It was a ton of behind the scenes effort and meant a lot to me personally as well. And now I've babbled a lot, so Jake, please.
Sure. This team has been really incredible in this arena, whether it is gender diversity, skin tone diversity, all of these things. It's a very conscious effort to make sure that our players can see themselves in the world. And I think Laura is really well positioned for this because in League, you have champions, but you don't have other characters. So you have these champions with these identities that are very gameplay focused sometimes. But for Laura, we have all this unexplored territory. So we were able to do things, including in set one, having openly queer characters that they like could be their own thing in the world and not have this other baggage of an existing character that people had expectations about, whatever those expectations may be. So you get to forge a new path, which is super awesome, and make the characters that make sense for your world. But a lot of this is a super supportive narrative and art team that looks for opportunities to tell really cool stories and sees these things instead of through the lens of risk, through the lens of opportunity. Um, because the more stories you can tell, like the better your game is going to be. Just like think about it from a gameplay perspective. If every character in your fighting game has a sword, well, that's kind of boring. You want to have characters with other abilities or other tools at their disposal. And same thing for identities. And something that our team years ago did a lot of work on was actually doing like demographic maps of Runeterra based on location. So you would get things like Demacia is very close to Shurima geographically. So you're like, okay, you should have a fairly large dark skinned population in Demacia because that makes sense in our world. And so you set metrics of like, oh, Demacia should be around this percentage black and dark skin. So that way you can point to that later in art and say, hey, this crowd scene should be a little bit different because of their position in the world, and making that more authentic and really like fully realized and fully fleshed out characters that have identities, that have places in the world, is something that I am incredibly grateful for.
Yeah, and we're lucky to be while they're like we said that the narrative and art teams have a unique opportunity to represent that. Obviously, the cosmetics team over on PXM put in the rainbow poro, and we have support from leadership to distribute that for free. Like we are lucky that we have a team that's very open on all levels that believes in this mission. And so it's a conversation about how to do this right, how to be honest about the risk we incur with it, as we are a global game and there are different laws in different countries as to stuff about this. And so we're lucky that it feels like a team effort, even if there are a few people who spearhead it. Like Jake does a ton of work on this. It's not an internal fight. It's about how do we do this right? How do we do this safely? How do we make sure that we're making people feel good with this and not tokenized and ostracized even more?
Yeah, there is so much buy-in at the leadership level, which is really great. And obviously, it's a process. Like as you probably saw in League last year, we shipped all these identity icons, and in client, they were named fairly uh, based on their color scheme, like Tanzanite Poro and all this, and they had an accompanying article in English that explained why we had these things in game. But that gave us a lot of flexibility where we could ship that content to players that otherwise wouldn't get to see it, and just not localize the article. And as a result, that content was available almost around the world. Like we shipped that content to Turkey and Russia, for example, which can be tricky, and you have to, those local differences can be significant. Um, but by making that different option here, just like we keep, Legion Veteran is in every copy of the game. Maybe he's localized slightly differently in different parts of the world, but that's okay. Like that's the trade-off you make with a global game. You reach as many people as you can instead of not doing the thing at all. And this team is really dedicated to let's do what we can in the areas where we can in ways that make sense.
Yeah, I
And
think
Jake and I care about this a lot. And Travis too,
it's
just been politely letting us ramble on.
Yeah, it's a huge thing for us. I think one big thing, especially when I was in the beta of the game, the Crimson Kids were a huge. You mentioned them earlier. Were a huge part of this because of this. People didn't expect it to actually us like Legend of Runeterra is finally going to have like not only one, two, but a huge multitude of different people that we could people see each other. Sorry, see each other in, right? Um, my interesting question for this is actually for the Crimson Kids in particular. They all have names and they all speak to each other, obviously, but for each card in the game, even like Quinn's Rangers refer to each other by actual names, right? Bert, obviously, for Grizzled Ranger, that's never written on a card anywhere, but like we know his name now, right? How much planning for narrative goes into? Is it every card? Does every card have a name? Does every card have a family? Like, to what extent do you guys plan every card out in terms of narratively?
So not every card has a name, but a lot of them do. The way we develop sets, we usually have the champion and then their followers, and they'll be kind of a group of followers is just a word for units associated with champion. And we will tell a story with that group of champion and followers and other groups, so they're cohesively knit together. So Quinn and her Rangers is a great example of that. You can see it with Misfortune and her crew. And then Elise has her spiders and some of the enamored nobles who follow her around and meet your best friend, Precious Pet there. So there is a lot of world building, both in terms of lore that already exists at Riot that we have access to, and then the rLOR lore team expands a lot on that as well, along with our concept and design partners. So it is that triangle at the beginning of sets development that works to make sure that tells a story. Narrative tries to bridge a goal of narrative is to bridge the gap between the art and design so that we are providing a narrative explanation as to why this character does this thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting too because that can be interpreted in so many different ways too, right? We have Riven at an Ionian farm with followers who are objectively against her, and yet that is still her followers because that's how they're telling a story with it. And I feel like this has been something that's been shown in many card games is the ability to tell stories through cards. But in LOR, I think it finally feels like every card, not just the key hallmarks, but everyone feels like they have a place in this overall narrative that they're being attached to, right? Hey, here's Fizz, here's all his fish friends. They're all really cool, right? And they all like interact with each other. Shell Shocker is probably the greatest voice acted card of all time. Things like that are just like adds so much more character to what is a relatively innocuous 2-1 with a keyword, right? Like, and to me, that shows a lot of care for the overall narrative for the game as well as the overall narrative for Runeterra moving forward, right? Because now just the sole fact that he has so much personality means that Shell Shockers can now appear in any property and you'll know who it is because how could you miss that voice, right? And I feel like that's a really core element of why the investment into the IP, so to speak, is so impressive for me in LOR, comparatively to a lot of other games where a soldier unit is a soldier unit, and that's what he does, right? And I think that's something that should be applauded for, especially.
You can see that with
Especially,
Cythria. Oh, I'm so
oh
sorry.
no, Cythria is a perfect example. I have to say, the Breathe music video, when Darius's cape floats up and you see Cythria standing there with the sword and the sun comes up, it is truly one of the most gorgeous shots I have ever seen in an animated short. That entire short in general is like a masterwork in terms of style, and I loved it a ton. But that keyframe, so to speak, was just so it showed like how much you guys are willing to invest, not just in like the hallmark champions who everyone loves, but even just characters that are just a part of the world and who are held almost to that same standard. And now we're seeing Cythria now appear in things like the Demacia book, I believe she was just featured in as well. She's in 3 different cards, technically more if you count the background of Garen and
Yeah.
those as well. Tiari's in, I think, 8, 9 cards, depending on how you track their progress up the mountain, which again, amazing choice. Making it the literal ascension from the mountain is a great choice for that as well. The narrative, I think, for LOR is going to be the big thing that really sells the game, at least for a lot of the lore fans, as being able to see a bigger open look into the world, especially after such a time stuck with just champions in LOL. Because those characters are great, but we definitely want to see them interact with things that aren't just themselves. And I think that's a really big part of it. Especially as we are looking into the Call of the Mountain set in general, a lot of the I think flourishing moments of the set were these amazing cinematics. We saw the cinematic with the 0-3 one drop in Targon. I apologize, I cannot remember her name. She has a dog. She guides a Stellacorn up the entirety to the Star Springs. Are those the sort of thing we like? How hard is it for you guys to really put that into production, so to speak? It seemed like a lot of style and a lot of work to not necessarily gamble, but to put it onto a card that relatively, compared to like an obvious choice such as Leona or Diana or Aurelion Soul would have been, it's kind of impressive to me. Can you like show me like how did you guys get to that choice for that character, that sort of thing?
So our amazing publishing team puts those together, also in partnership sometimes with external animation studios. And they have pretty short timelines that we let them look at the art and the cards before they're finished, before they launch. And I know we especially put them under extra stress with the decision to pivot to splitting set releases, because they're like, oh, we have to do 3 of these now. And they handled it beautifully. Our big shout out to our publishing team. I'm not sure how they come to those decisions. They are just they look at the cards and find something compelling. Maybe I'm not sure.
Yeah, they're really really cool, especially when we also saw the sort of in expansion in between cinematics were really cool. The Tom Kench tidal wave was inspired. That was really cool. And just recently, we obviously had the creation like sort of forging out of the stone for Zoe, Victor, and Ribbon, which was also really really great. I had actually a quick question about some of the sound design and stuff like that. I'm not sure if any of you guys can answer that, but some of the cards and have really unique sounds. I think a lot of these that come to me, at least for me personally, like Skitterer and the Fearsome package have these really, really nice sort of sound design on the spiders themselves. How do you guys like sort of come to those choices for sound design? If you guys have anyone here who's worked with the sound on it at all. If not, it's totally cool.
Not we have a really world-class audio team who spends a lot of time doing sound design. That's the best that I know.
Yeah, that's totally fair. It just, especially with things such as like I think the biggest one that a lot of people really point to is Swain's level up animation, which feels very evocative, not with just the music, but the slam of his demon hand onto the map, which is great many times over. But it was also just like the sound of it is just very very resonant, especially for what a big moment a Swain level up tends to be in a Legends of Runeterra card game. Especially as we're looking back to say Rising Tides with a lot of the design on champions, where are you guys sort of seeing these champions get designed for? So when I say that, for example, Nautilus feels very much in tide with the deep theme, right? He's explicitly about deep, and that's a strict one-to-one tie-in with a mechanic. Whereas some champions such as Misfortune, for example, fit a vast variety of decks. And despite being the same power level, they have a very unique sound design. And I think that's Misfortune now is in different decks and can be experimented on in slightly more different ways than perhaps a Nautilus really can be. You can see this also with certain cards, such as Riven being tied to the reforging mechanic, whereas some like Garen are just tied to literally striking anything. Which, I mean, that's not a bad thing by any means. Obviously, variety is great, but how do you guys sort of decide which champions are going to be focused, so to speak, on a mechanic, and which ones are going to be broader, so to speak?
I can answer this. Um, Although it's not a really flashy answer, honestly, it's part of the ideation for whichever game designer is making the champions. We like use Nautilus as example. He has a very strong thematic of being deep in the ocean. I don't remember exactly how we came up with the deep keyword, but I'm sure that like it started with Nautilus because he's deep in the ocean, and so there's no specific pattern or development process we use for making that determination how this champion will fit or whatever. It's more like in ideation, we find cool ideas that we like, and then they are sharpened over time. Some are thrown away, and some become like deep and specific, and others are more broad, like Garen.
Mhm.
And to kind of follow up on that, each set has a like a complexity rating. So we have a budget of complexity, at least in concept, because you know we can make all these really cool cards, but they're really really complicated to interact with. It's not going to be super accessible to new players. So that doesn't necessarily answer the question of like who gets the more straightforward mechanics, but having a card like Nautilus, or having the Spiders deck with Elise, or tribal decks like Poros or Elites, those decks can be easier for players to understand. Oh, well, this buffs other elites. I just want to put a bunch of elites in my deck. Cool, I can understand that, and that gives us the design space to make more complicated cards that are going to take up more of your brain to try and play. That way, you can serve different kind of player types.
Perfect. And actually, speaking about complexity, because this is actually something we have a lot of discussions on in the custom subreddit, is timing windows in Legends of Runeterra. I'm not sure if you guys what the proper vernacular term you guys might be using in internally, but for example, one thing that we found was interesting. Me and my friend were just basically testing to try to break the game. Was that we had Mountain Scryer enter in at round start with War Mothers. Now, Invoke typically lets you choose one of three, obviously, as we know. But when you do it with Mountain Scryer at round start, instead he gives you a random Celestial, which to me implies that you guys do not want priority to be wildly shifting at the beginning of a turn. Could you guys give me more insight into how timing works in Legends of Runeterra, specifically to round start and perhaps when I'm summoned effects?
That's a pretty complicated question. Um, for like determining the timings of things, honestly, the way our team generally designs everything from a contest perspective is we make it OP first. We make like the most exciting degenerate form of a card that we can. And so sometimes that means you have a spell that should be slow that's fast. I can remember once a long time ago, the Ruination was a fast spell, which means you could cast it in combat defensively when your opponent attacked you, which is obscene. We
Yeah.
ended up not shipping that version, right? To your second part of your question, um, how it works is really complicated. I don't know if you want to spend 5 minutes of me explaining
That's fair.
exactly how round
That's
start
fair.
and round in works.
Yeah. That's totally fair. I was just more like just in more to what you guys are intending more than anything else. I think me and my friend who work on engines and stuff like that, we're sort of piecing it together just by testing a bunch of different things. But is your guys' intention to have round start effects be an engagement, like a decision point, or are they just supposed to actively pass, so to speak? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. So our number one goal is to make sure players can understand what is happening. And I think one of the most complicated parts of our game right now is round in and round start effects. Because like it's really hard. There's no oracle's eye for what's happening next turn when both players pass, right? So we, as Jake mentioned in one of his previous answers, we take complexity very seriously. We don't want our game to become so complicated that people can't play it and can't figure out what's going on. So that usually means that when a set's in its infancy, when we have the first 100 cards or whatever, there are way more round start and round ends that are going to make it to players, because when you start adding too many of those together, it's really hard to tell what's happening. It's actually happening right now on live where there's a lot, and sometimes it's really hard to tell what's going to happen if the right card combinations are on the field at the end of a turn. So because of that, it is extremely unlikely, although I won't say never, that we are going to add interaction points for end of turn or start of turn, end of round or start of round, because that would just inject a whole nother magnitude of complexity into those portions of the game.
Yeah, it was like something we were noticing. Like, for example, one thing we love to do in the custom area is precedent is king, basically, where we just look at current cards and see how you guys have designed them. Like, for example, all when I'm discarded effects never target. They are all specifically something that activates instantly, and that is very clearly a decision point, because that means if you have a round start effect or round end effect that discards a card that asks you to target, what's going to happen to the card? And that's a huge thing with, say, like Bookie, for example, which was our biggest point forward for that. It was actually an interesting thing to note, is because we don't have a tapped mechanic or something that is equivalent to spending a unit for the turn. Instead, I at least I interpret it to mean that when you guys are doing things such as Tom Kench gets Tom's dinner or Victor gets Hex Core or whatever, these are equivalent to, in decision design space, to activated effects where it's a one-time per turn effect that happens every turn. Is that what you guys are sort of looking at it as, or have you guys not even considered that whatsoever?
I can answer part of that. You can go ahead.
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
No, it's very specific. I'm not sure what the answer is.
So it is generally part of the complexity. It's also kind of a mobile consideration too, that kind of interaction point's not super great always. But yeah, it is the closest we probably have to a tap effect or an exhaust or a resource mechanic. But also a lot of those effects that create cards in hand, we have to be careful. Like we talked about gems earlier, having a face-up combat trick that can be played at faster burst speed is really, really, really brain power intensive. Like you have to play around it every turn. So a lot of those cards are fleeting, or they're slow, or both, to make that complexity a lot less difficult to manage.
And I think the only one, and then the only one that really is evident on, is someone whose entire identity is based on, and that's Draven, of course. And that is like, there's the one champion who gets to do this, and that's sort of like the I guess concept behind this. One thing I noticed as well is that all the blade fragments are the same gem speed, obviously, which leads to a vast difference, and which is also interesting because that also means that Riven and Draven are completely distinct in terms of what their hypothetical identities are, right? Because Draven and Riven are both 3-drops, both in Noxus. They're going to be compared to each other, but instead now you have a clear distinction between the two, almost strictly because of speed, right? And that is going to change a lot of how people play both cards entirely. But yeah, anyways, thank you so much to you guys for coming by. This has been like a really great chat. I know you've answered a bunch of pretty ridiculous questions, so I really do appreciate you guys coming by. It was a really great time. So we are actually going to be heading off to the top 8 tournament for the rLOR tournament right now. So thank you again so much for joining us. If you like, you can stick around in the Discord. We have a little chat there for the event space there for you guys to hop into and talk to if you like to. But before we go, I also want to specifically thank you, Tiny Bun. I heard you've moved on to LOL team now. So I wanted to appreciate you coming back to LOR to come talk with us one last time before you head off to that. And so from all of us from the community, thank you so much, and we wish you best for your future in LOL.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me back. I've loved being on this team. I really love lore, and I'm super excited to get to experience it next year as a player instead of as a developer. I think I'm gonna love it even more.
Of course, of course. Well, I think that's all the time we have for now. Thank you again, guys. We will see you guys next time. See you next year. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.